Russia and your mandate. So my question is, realistically, what do you think can actually be accomplished if they continue to not engage? And what would you like to see from other member states?
Yeah, thank you for this question. It's very important. First of all, it's not just Russia that is not engaging. We're about 13, very small group of special procedures, special rapporteurs, country mandate holders, as opposed to our colleagues who are thematic mandate holders, special rapporteurs. But the country ones are really, we're rare, we're the most sensitive and the most vulnerable because our mandates are voted by the Human Rights Council member states every year. We don't know, whether the mandate would continue beyond this 1 year. My mandate was just voted in Geneva on 7th of October. So I'm grateful that we have another year to continue working because the situation is deteriorating. Now, it's very important that the United Nations member states know the situation in Russia on one level. All member states, who are, as you know, in the Human Rights Council, they rotate. So it's not just one regional group, they're all regional groups. And for the first time, through this mandate on Russia in 2023, there was a report in 80 years of the existence of the UN after World War II. For the first time, there was a report on human rights in Russia. So on one level, it's the knowledge of the world and the United Nations governments and member states, what's happening in Russia. This is a very important contribution of this mandate. Secondly, Russia is, one of the leaders of the United Nations. As I said, one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. Russia and her colleagues, the other P5, they're deciding on security in the world. They're deciding questions on safety, on security in other conflict zones in the world. So when you have a country like that, violating, first of all, the human rights of their own people, and I maintain that the repression at home is intimately connected to the aggression abroad against the neighboring Ukrainian people. These are the governments that should be leading the way and showing respect for the human rights conventions and the whole instruments of international human rights law, humanitarian law, and United Nations has come up with all these conventions. So giving them recommendations, whether they're following or not, is keeping the high standard of accountability for a government as it should be. Whether it's Russia or another one, but Russia has a double responsibility as a permanent member. So that's very important. And as one human rights defender, we had a special side event yesterday, Rule of Fear, it's called, as opposed to Rule of Law. And there was Russian lawyers, human rights defenders that participated in it. As one of them said, what the special rapporteur is doing, what I'm doing with this mandate is a record of repression. I don't know, летопись, как переводим? Летопись. Chronicles of repression. Sorry, I'm Bulgarian, my Russian sometimes let me down. Yeah, it's a chronicle of repression. It's a chronicle of failure to protect the rights of its own people. And Russia has to be held accountable. To the international community, I always also give recommendations. One of them is really justice inside Russia is unattainable. This is clear because the whole justice system is politicized. Because judges are listening to victims of torture and not even opening or ordering investigation into the allegations. The whole system, and then sentencing them to lengthy prison terms. So one of the things that I'm asking the international community is to look into their national provisions in their national legislation and use the framework of universal jurisdiction. I know it's difficult, but it's not impossible. And it needs political will. It also needs resources for their prosecutors, for their justice system to look into this. Um, I really believe that we should put on notice. I work on Russia, but I mean, it applies to all other countries. We should put on notice all of the torturers, the directors of prisons where political prisoners die under mysterious circumstances, where torture continues. We should put on notice the judges for not paying attention to allegations of torture by the victims, who nevertheless, for political reasons, are giving and using, the national security legislation, justifying terrorism, or the whole bundle of laws on war censorship, discrediting the Russian army and so forth. They should be put on notice. And I never propagate or comment on economic sanctions because, frankly, I think it's a tool of member states. I personally don't necessarily promote this. I haven't seen that it worked in other countries because dictators always stay untouchable, and it's the people, the population that suffers of such economic sanctions. But I'm absolutely all for human rights sanctions, putting on notice by name those who continue to torture, who continue to repress the innocent and to hurt them in each country, but in Russia to begin with. I work on Russia. So this is, and the third thing I'm asking the international community, I'm very preoccupied with the Ukrainian civilian detainees in Russia, thousands of them, including the children. Look, our humanitarian law provides us with some framework at the end of this conflict, of this war. There will be for sure all for all exchange of prisoners of war. But how about the civilian detainees? And how about the Russian political prisoners who are languishing in prison because they were against the war? So what would happen to them? And I think the international community should look out of the box. The times are demanding it, and come up with an international mechanism which, of course, with the involvement of the International Committee of the Red Cross, or the custodians of the humanitarian law. However, come up with a mechanism that would demand the beginning of the release or facilitate the release of the civilian detainees, Ukrainians, regardless of the outcome of peace talks, regardless of what these peace talks come up and decide in the end. Because otherwise, it's a very worrying situation, and many of them are dying in detention. And trust me, I'm sending constantly to member states, various member states, this list, and I'm ready to provide them to the Russian authorities. They're in my reports in many ways. Lists of political prisoners and Russian and Ukrainian detainees, civilian, that are really close to death because they're either torture victims, or they have been subjected to starvation, or they have cancer and other diseases. And I think they should start releasing them, even on humanitarian grounds. These are among some of the recommendations I'm giving. And of course, protection of the human rights defenders from Russia. I absolutely speak to all member states, many of them very supportive of my mandate. But we have a tough talk sometimes with member states, and the European Union included, when human rights defenders from Russia are treated like perpetrators and enemies purely on, some kind of Russophobic sentiments of the governments in power and government change. So, for example, several days ago, one member state detained at their border one human rights defender. She had a Schengen visa, but they annulled it, and they sent her back. They deported her, thank God, not to Russia, to another country, but to Turkey. But still, this is unacceptable. Russian human rights defenders should be able to open bank accounts, able to operate in exile, which is not happening in many countries. This is what I'm advocating for.
Please go ahead.